I wasn't looking for orphanages when I started researching 19th century census records. I was comparing population tables, city by city, decade by decade, just trying to understand how fast American cities actually grew after the Civil War. It was supposed to be background work, the kind of quiet, tedious counting that leads nowhere interesting and ends up in a folder you never open again. And then I pulled up the intake logs, not summaries, not estimates. The actual admission ledgers from institutional homes in New York, Boston, and Philadelphia between 1854 and 1904. I cross-referenced them against the census returns for those same cities in those same years. And the numbers on those pages did not match the populations they drew from, not even close. Once I saw that gap, once I measured it, I couldn't stop looking. A single leather-bound intake register from the New York Foundling Hospital, established in 1869 by the Sisters of Charity on East 68th Street in Manhattan. That register, still held in the archives of the Archdiocese of New York, records the admission of over 2,500 children in its first year of operation alone. 2,500 in one building, through one doorway. In 12 months. Now hold that number in your mind and sit with what it requires. The total population of Manhattan in 1870, according to the United States Census Bureau, was approximately 942,000. The average birth rate in American cities during that decade hovered around 35 live births per 1,000 residents. That gives Manhattan roughly 33,000 births per year. For a single institution to absorb 2,500 children, not over a decade, not across a network of branch facilities, but through one entrance on one street, that institution would need to be capturing nearly 8% of every child born on the entire island, not 8% of orphans, not 8% of the destitute, 8% of all births. Every birth, rich and poor alike. And the Foundling Hospital was not alone. It was one of more than 24 child processing institutions operating in New York City simultaneously during the same period. The Children's Aid Society, founded by Charles Loring Brace in 1853, reported placing over 92,000 children on westbound trains between 1854 and 1929, a figure preserved in organizational records held at the National Orphan Train Complex in Concordia, Kansas. 92,000 children from a single organization. Think about what that volume demands, not emotionally, but logistically. Think about the supply chain. The volume of children passing through these institutions predates and far exceeds any conventional demographic model for how many orphans a city of that size should produce in that era. Where were all these children coming from? What families were dissolving at this rate, in this concentration, for this long? And that's when the official explanation stopped making sense. This raises a simple but critical question. If the orphanages were processing more children than the cities around them could plausibly produce through documented births, deaths, and family dissolutions, where did the surplus come from? You have likely heard the standard answer: poverty, immigration, disease, parental death from cholera, from tuberculosis, from factory accidents. And yes, each of those pressures was real. Each contributed to family collapse in the industrial era. No one disputes that. But contribution is not explanation. A contributing factor does not account for the scale. And when you begin mapping the numbers, not reading about them, but actually mapping them across the country, across the century, across the ocean, you find that the same impossible arithmetic appears wherever large-scale child institutions operated. Not in one city, not in two. Across the world, begin in London, 1860s. The Foundling Hospital in Bloomsbury, one of the oldest charitable institutions in England, established by Sea Captain Thomas Coram in 1739, was receiving over 400 petitions per month for infant admission by the middle of the 19th century. 400 petitions per month in a single district. Records held at the London Metropolitan Archives show that at its peak, the hospital could accept fewer than 1 in 5 applicants. Think about what that means. 80% of those children were turned away, and the institution was still overflowing. The streets of Bloomsbury were not producing that volume of abandoned newborns. The adjacent parishes of St. Deed, Pancras, and Holborn combined had a total population that cannot support those intake figures using any standard demographic model. The math breaks. Yet the children were there, documented, real, tagged with fabric swatches and small admission tokens that you can still see today, displayed in glass cases at the Foundling Museum on Brunswick Square. You can visit. You can stand in front of those cases. Small torn pieces of cloth, a coin, a thimble, the last thing a mother left with her child before the door closed. Look at them, count them, then count the births. Now move to Melbourne, Australia, 1850s onward. The Melbourne Orphan Asylum on Brighton Road, a long brick institution whose iron gates still carried the cold of the Southern Ocean air, processed over 5,000 children between 1851 and 1900, nearly 5 decades of continuous intake. Victoria's colonial population in 1851 was barely 77,000. Even accounting for the massive gold rush influx that followed, the per capita rate of institutionalized children in the colony of Victoria exceeded anything demographers have been able to model using conventional birth and mortality data. Not a theory. Not a guess. A statistical residual, a gap between the children who entered the system and the children the population could have created that no published study has adequately closed. The records are there. The children were counted. The population was counted. The two counts do not agree. So where were the extra children coming from on the far side of the world in a colony barely old enough to have a generation of its own? Crossed to South America. In Buenos Aires, the Casa de Explositos, the foundling house established under Spanish colonial rule in 1779. Its stone walls still standing in the San Telmo district, recorded intake numbers in the early 1800s that equaled or exceeded those of its counterpart institution in Madrid, a city roughly 5 times its size at the time. The intake ledgers examined by Argentine historian José Luis Moreno in his 1994 study on child abandonment in the Rio de la Plata region reveal spikes in admission that do not correspond to any known epidemic economic crisis or recorded population event. No war, no famine, no documented plague. The children simply appeared in waves, dozens in a week, then silence, then dozens more. And then the waves subsided. And then they came again. No one has explained the rhythm. The pattern repeats with unsettling precision. St. Petersburg, Russia. The Imperial Foundling Home opened in 1770 under Catherine the Great, a massive gray stone building on the Moika River embankment, its corridors echoing with the sound of hundreds of infants crying at once. Admitted over 25. Zeros. Trialed in its first 15 years of operation, 25,000, in a city whose total population at the time was approximately 200,000. Ask yourself what ratio that represents. 1 institutionalized infant for every 8 residents. Ask yourself how a city of that size generates that many parentless children in a decade and a half while simultaneously growing, functioning, building palaces, waging wars, expanding its empire. The mortality rate inside the institution exceeded 60% in certain years. Historian David Ransell documented this extensively in his 1988 work, Mothers of Misery, published by Princeton University Press. Children arrived. Children died. More arrived. The pipeline never slowed. It never even paused. And then there is the American Midwest, the receiving end of the longest child distribution network in modern history. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. Between 1854 and 1929, the orphan trains carried children, not only from New York, but from Boston, Philadelphia, Baltimore, and other eastern seaboard cities, and deposited them in rural communities across the Great Plains and beyond. The Children's Aid Society alone distributed children across more than 45 states and territories. They arrived at train platforms in groups of 30 or 40, sometimes more. They were lined up on stages in town halls, in churches, in general stores. Local families walked along the line and selected them. The language used in contemporary accounts is revealing. Notice it. Charles Loring Brace himself, the architect of the system, described these children not as rescued but as redistributed, not saved, not adopted, moved, redistributed, like inventory, like seed stock for counties that needed hands. And the communities receiving them were small, towns of 300, 500, 800 people, absorbing 10, 15, 20 children in a single afternoon. No background verification, no home inspections, no follow-up visits in many documented cases for years. These were not adoption proceedings, they were placements. Transfers of human inventory on a logistical scale that would overwhelm a modern child welfare agency with its databases and caseworkers and legal frameworks. Executed with handwritten name tags and rail timetables across a continent that still moved by horse and cart outside the narrow corridors of the railroad lines. And if the volume alone were the only anomaly, you might still find a comfortable explanation. But it isn't. What makes this harder to set aside is the silence that surrounds it, not a loud silence, not the silence of doors slammed shut, but the silence of doors never opened. Consider what happens when you walk into a research library today and ask to study orphan-trained demographics. You will find fragments, a digitized ledger here, a faded tintype photograph there, a county record in Iowa, a church register in Nebraska, the National Orphan Train Complex in Concordia, Kansas, the single institution most dedicated to preserving this history in the entire country, operates out of a modest building in a town of fewer than 5,200 people. That is the scale of institutional attention given to a program that relocated nearly 250,000 children across the United States over 3/4 of a century. Not active suppression, passive erasure. They sit in archive boxes, in church basements, in county courthouse storage rooms across Nebraska, Kansas, Iowa, Missouri, and Texas. But they are not digitized as a unified data set. They are not cross-referenced against census returns. They are not analyzed with the demographic tools and computational methods we now possess. No major research university has undertaken a comprehensive statistical audit comparing orphanage intake volumes against verified local birth, death, and immigration rates for the cities that fed the system. Not Harvard, not Columbia, not the University of Chicago. No one. Questions that simply aren't asked. The Smithsonian Institution holds photographs from the orphan train era. The New York Public Library holds correspondence between placement agents and receiving families. The data exists in pieces scattered across 100 repositories, and no one has assembled the complete picture. Not because the work is forbidden, because it is unfunded, because the question itself, where did all these children actually come from, is treated as already answered. Poverty, immigration, moral failure. Next exhibit. Next gallery, move along. And that quiet procedural dismissal, that willingness to accept an answer that does not survive contact with the actual numbers, is what troubles me most. Not a conspiracy, not a shadowy network. Just a collective agreement maintained across generations of scholars and archivists to stop counting before the count gets uncomfortable. I'm not claiming that orphanages were manufacturing children from thin air. I'm not suggesting some vast trafficking network was operating under the cover of charitable institutions. I'm asking something far simpler, far more grounded, and far harder to dismiss. I'm asking why the arithmetic does not balance. I'm asking why no one with the funding and the computational resources to run those numbers has chosen to do so. What if the census figures we rely on for this period are substantially incomplete, not through deliberate falsification, but through the structural limitations of counting impoverished transient and undocumented populations in cities that were growing faster than their bureaucracies could possibly track? What if entire communities existed in the gaps between census sweeps, people who were never counted arriving, never counted leaving, visible only in the intake logs of the institutions that processed their children? What if the orphanage system was not merely a response to urban crisis, but a mechanism of demographic redistribution, a means of moving population surplus from places that had too much density to places that desperately needed labor? All of it wrapped in the language of Christian charity, because that language made the movement invisible, made it virtuous, made it something no one would question? What if the real function of the orphan trains was not rescue at all, but resettlement, a parallel migration system operating alongside official immigration channels, moving children not because they had no parents, but because their parents could not be documented, could not be claimed, could not be made to fit neatly into the columns of a census sheet? Consider what that would mean. It would mean the story you were told about westward expansion, that it was driven by pioneers, by homesteaders, by families choosing a new life, is incomplete. It would mean that part of the labor force that built the agricultural Midwest was shipped there as children, relabeled as orphans, and absorbed into communities that never asked where they really came from. The evidence suggests something much larger than a charitable response to urban poverty. Look at this from where you sit right now. Close the screen for a moment and think about the scale of what was built. The buildings still stand. The New York Foundling Hospital on East 68th Street is still there, repurposed, renamed, its original function folded quietly into the institutional memory of a city that builds over its past, the way coral builds over bone. The train depots where children stood in lines, names pinned to their collars, are still there, too, in small towns across Kansas, across Iowa. Across Texas, their wooden platforms weathered and cracked, but still holding the weight of what happened on them. The photographs persist, rows of children in white smocks, eyes forward, hands at their sides, faces too still for their age. You can find those photographs in any archive that cares to look. You can count the faces. And if you count them, if you sit down and actually count them, and then you count the births recorded in the city that sent them, you will arrive at the same place I arrived. Not an answer. A gap. A silence shaped like a number that should be there and is not. The ledgers remember, even if we don't. They sit in their boxes, in their basements, patient and unread, holding a count that no one has finished tallying, a sum that keeps growing the further back you look and the more carefully you add. But patience is not silence. Those records are waiting for someone to open them again, to sit down with the numbers, to finish the count that was abandoned a century ago. Maybe that someone is listening right now. And if 250,000 children could be moved across an entire continent in plain sight, documented and photographed and never fully accounted for, what else was moved that left no photographs at all?